Out of Ottawa, Jane Philpott, Canada's health minister, talking about the assisted dying bill, which is yet to be passed into law. Let's listen in right now.
Quelles sont vos recommandations aux médecins? Quelles sont vos recommandations aux médecins?
Recommendations to doctors. Well, the doctors, I recommend that they contact their associations that provide notices or advices on regarding legality of this, and they will probably hear that they need to have a legal notice for this. My French needs to improve.
Minister, why are the provincial guidelines inadequate? You said that in your speech here today.
So I want to first of all thank all of the organizations, the regulatory bodies across the country that have put guidelines in place, and they've done so in a responsible fashion. The challenge is that they are so different across the country, and so that leads to a patchwork in and of itself. But there are also some gaps, and so one of the things that the Supreme Court asked us to do was to provide that legislative framework, and within that framework provide appropriate safeguards. So, for instance, safeguards around age are very different across the country. Some of the regulatory recommendations talk about an age of 18 or over, and some don't. So there are challenges there. There are differences in terms of how many witnesses are required. In some cases, it's 2 witnesses. In others, 1, and in some of the regulatory guidelines, there's no provision for someone to witness the signature of the patient. So we very thoughtfully went through every possible safeguard, and we feel confident that the legislation provides those appropriate safeguards, and while the regulations are well done, they're insufficient.
What went wrong, Minister? Why isn't there a law today? What could your government have done differently?
Well, lots of things you would do somewhat differently in retrospect, and it was a hugely challenging task to be able to get this piece of legislation in place, and it takes time to be able to move something along that's as complex as this.
Could you have introduced it earlier then?
At this point, I would say what I'm looking forward to is what we're going to be able to do over the next few days. I hope that the gap will not be long. I think it's still possible that we'll have legislation in place in the very near future.
Minister, you talked about palliative care a lot in your speech and the importance of it, but those words were missing from the budget. Can you talk a little bit about what your government is going to be doing over the coming years? Do you support amendments to the Canada Health Act, or do you think this is better handled through the health accords with the provinces?
Well, as you know, the provision of health care, the delivery of health care is largely in the jurisdiction of provinces and territories, although I think the federal government can play an important role in that. We want to make investments to make it possible for excellent palliative care to be delivered across the country. And I have said repeatedly that I believe every Canadian should have access to high-quality palliative care. We need to find the mechanisms that the federal government can work with the provinces and territories to make that possible.
So you think it will be through the health accords, rather?
Largely, our investments through the health accord will make a big difference, but it's also at conferences like the one that we're at today where we realize that it's not just governments that do the care delivery. There are some fantastic models of palliative care across this country, and you can speak to the people here today that provide those. They need help figuring out how to scale up those best models. We can often deliver better care at lower cost and more patient satisfaction if we work well together.
What changes to the Canada Health Act?
From Peter Hogg today, constitutional expert, and he's going to be telling them that C-14 will be struck down by the courts. It's not constitutional. Why not just ask him in the first place?
Our government, including, of course, the Minister of Justice, have consulted widely across the country, and on many matters of legislation, not least of which there's a diversity of opinions as to what the responsibilities are and how legislation meets up with the Constitution. We firmly support the fact that this piece of legislation is compliant to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada, that it responds in an appropriate and responsible way to the Carter decision, and there has been no shortage of consultation with that.
Peter Hogg is not an obscure voice. Peter Hogg is not just sort of an obscure opinion. He is probably the preeminent constitutional expert in this country. Do you really think that you're just dismissing what he's saying about the constitutionality of it?
I have the utmost respect for a number of constitutional scholars across the country, but I think if you were to ask constitutional scholars, there would be some disagreement about that. And so with the greatest of respect, I would say that our government had the responsibility to respond to the Carter decision. And what they asked us to do was to make sure that we affirmed that medical assistance in dying must be available to Canadians, and our legislation does that. They also asked us to put in place safeguards that would protect vulnerable people across the country. We have to uphold not only individuals' rights to be able to have assistance in dying, but we have to uphold our responsibility to care for 36 million people across this country and make sure that vulnerable people are protected.
Regarding amendments, Ms. Philpott, the senator is saying that they will absolutely table those amendments, and a majority of senators want to modify the bill. So how much are you ready to put water in your wine so it's not a ping-pong match between the Senate and the Commons? We've said many times that we will accept and listen to suggestions of amendment from the Senate. And now, up to now, we are still waiting to have the details of those amendments, and we will look at them when they come.
Considering
We'll have more details.
Considering the patchwork, should doctors go